And welcome back to the final segment of our show this morning, where we will be discussing refugees. And we have on the set with us this morning Kelleen Corrigan. She is the Protection Officer at the United Nations Refugee Agency. We also have Enrique, the Director for Help for Progress. And of course, we're discussing World Refugee Day, which was held on June 20th. And so we're going to get everything that we need to know about the state of refugees in the country of Belize.
That's right. All right, thank you for having us. So let's start off with the role of the United Nations Refugee Agency. And since you have reestablished office in Belize, your office in Belize, what kind of work you've been doing?
Sure, and I think sometimes maybe it's helpful to go back and talk about where we were before.
Yes.
We did, as you mentioned, recently came back to Belize in about late 2015 and have been doing some work here, which I'll talk about in a moment. I'm wondering if maybe Rick wants to say something about UNHCR used to be here back in the 1990s and left in 1998, the physical office, but has continued to be here since then through missions and short-term, but we have physical presence here consistently now.
Yes.
And Rick may want to say something about the time. He was actually our implementing partner since back in the 1990s, so actually has information very pertinent since those days.
Yeah. Yes, as Kelleen mentioned, no, in 1998, UNHCR, after the peace accords were signed in Central America, UNHCR closed its office in Belize, but there was work to do in terms of the population of refugees that were in a process of regularization of their status. That was like, in terms of the numbers, just over 3,000 persons that had chose to remain in Belize as the durable solution. They were regularizing their status to either permanent residency or Belizean nationality based on the number of years that they had been in the country.
You know, it's a great opportunity to have a history lesson as well, because I recall maybe a year or two ago, my nephew called me and said, okay, tell me what were the refugee settlements from back in the day and what they're called today. And I realized that you really have to go through a lot. I mean, we know Valley of Peace, for example. There are a couple notable ones right outside the fringes of Belmopan. But let's go back to that, because I realized in conversation with him, he's a teenager, that a lot of people aren't aware that we did take refugees in at a certain point in time, what was happening in Central America all around us, and why it was necessary to have this influx, or why we agreed to have this influx of persons seek refuge or safety here in Belize. So if we could do a shortened version,
Yes. Well, they did a mapping of communities that were impacted by refugees, because we have to remember that in Belize, we, unlike other countries, we didn't have camps. So people were coming to communities where families would accept these people into their homes, realizing the vulnerability of these people, and the government was at the time not prepared with facilities to accommodate these people. So from the mapping, we identified 66 communities throughout Belize, and I'm talking about all 6 districts, where these people were settling. What was the pull factor then was that wherever they could find shelter, wherever they could find jobs, these people were settling. So those 66 communities, as I said, were dispersed throughout Belize from north to south. But the bulk of the Central Americans were in the Cayo district.
And you said the average was 3,000 at that time who decided to stay?
No, those were persons who were recognized as refugees and desired to regularize their status to remain in Belize, right?
Can I move away from the historical aspect briefly? I am more interested and concerned with the impact of the migration of refugees into Belize in terms of the social impact, the political impact, and I'm not specifically referring to party political, but the overall scope of it. Because when you look at the number of Central American immigrants, which would include refugees from the past as well, they have contributed to the population growth in terms of having kids and their generations, etc. They have also contributed to areas of industry, for instance, agriculture, and of course, the use of land for residential purposes. Can you speak to us on what the overall impact or dynamic of having a refugee population in Belize has been like?
Either one.
Sure. Well, can I say one thing? I just want to clarify one thing, I think, before, is to clarify the definition of refugees versus migrants. Because a refugee is someone who is involuntarily fleeing their country, right? Because of war, persecution, violence. And migrants are people who are looking for a better life. So sometimes I think they get conflated, and it's important to remind ourselves that refugees are people who are coming and seeking safety, and the people that I've spoken with who've sought refugee status here in Belize have, to a person, been so grateful for the opportunity to be here and for the safety and sort of I can walk down the street feeling safe and really want to contribute to this country. So I think it's an important preface to and these are people who actually, according to international law, cannot be returned. So those are things that are important to keep in mind. So considering how to best utilize the skills that they have, the absolute willingness they have to provide the best that they can to this country. And so then I guess I'll turn over to Rick to actually talk a bit about some of the more specifics, perhaps.
The term we use is the mixed migration flow of persons that are coming, because I think the concern is that people are saying, in our communities, we feel that we are getting inundated with migrants, no? But not all migrants are refugees, as Kelleen rightly explained, no? And some people are here for economic reasons, With respect to the impact that you made reference to, in terms of the population, the number of identified refugees or recognized refugees are very small at this moment. Yes, we know that people are coming, keep coming to Belize out of fear or for refugee-like reasons. And given what is happening in the region, we can anticipate that more people will, unless there's some kind of regional solution to the problems that exist primarily in the countries that are generating refugees, we could expect some more persons coming. No?
Now this is an immigration issue first and foremost.
Yes.
Do you know if there is a refugee policy, for instance, that would be able to speak to this kind of movement?
Can I interject there, because I wanted to also talk about the fact that the reactivation of the refugee committee that took place over 2 years ago is actually what led to the reestablishment of your office here in country. And I think that oftentimes what has taken place very clearly is that people really see migration and refugees as the same. Can you very clearly give us what your definition is and what happens when a person who has migrated into the country seeks refugee status but doesn't qualify? What happens then?
So the definition of a refugee based in international law in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, which is the international community came together and decided that definition is, someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution and is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin because of a fear of a persecution based upon race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. So it can be gang-related activities, or violence in their communities, war. It could be. And so usually it's more specific. I mean, war is a broader definition, so I don't want to get too much into the technical aspects, but the people that we're seeing here generally are people who are fleeing from situations of, as you mentioned, gangs. We're seeing young women who are facing the prospect of being forcibly trafficked or taken as the girlfriend of a gang member, and if she refuses, what could happen to her? She could be killed, or could be forcibly taken. Young kids who stop going to school because they're afraid of being forcibly recruited. People who are have worked hard to have small businesses who are being extorted. And so these are the people who are fleeing. They're not the persecutors. They're the victims of this, the perpetrators. So Belize actually is quite advanced in that it has a Refugees Act since 1991, after signing the Refugee Convention, after becoming a party to the Refugee Convention. So the way it should work is someone would come into the country and go to the Refugees Department, which also was reestablished in 2016, last year, and should apply for asylum. They would review the case, do an interview with the person, find out if they have a legitimate asylum claim, right? Exactly. If they meet the definition of a refugee, and the Belizean Refugee Act is very much exactly identical, basically, with the Refugee Convention, and is in fact a little bit broader, which is fantastic. I mean, it really provides strong protections. And then the Refugee Eligibility Committee, which is made up of a number of stakeholders from different ministries and civil society, look at the case and make a recommendation. And
literally say, yes, you qualify as a refugee,
correct.
or no, you don't.
Right, based upon the technical criteria for it, exactly that.
So my question is, what happens when somebody does not meet the criteria?
So, there are certain issues that probably it would be better for the government to actually respond to, since they are the ones who are leading this process. Generally speaking, I could say that when people may apply for asylum somewhere and be adjudicated to not be a refugee, they then would probably just follow under the regular immigration. If they had some other way, if they had a family member or some other way to maintain status, potentially, or they could face being returned to their home country. If they're not a refugee, for us, it's then the migration authorities would make that determination.
And since the reestablishment of your office and the reactivation of the committee, how many refugees have we taken into the country?
So again, that's something that really we're not able to respond to, since the government is the entity that has started taking the registration and is working on the adjudications. So we really, Help for Progress was doing registrations until the Refugees Department was instituted. So at this moment, we don't have the detailed numbers, although we believe that the Refugees Department has registered about 2,600 asylum seekers who are in the process. Besides that, we don't have more information about this.
Were there some challenges leading up to this, to the reinstitution of the office and what have you, insofar as Help for Progress? If I recall, somewhere in the news coverage about a year and a half or so ago, the name of the organization came up, and there seemed to have been some issues surrounding the work that was being done. Can you speak to that insofar as contextualizing it?
As was mentioned before, that after the departure of UNHCR, Help for Progress was partnered in with UNHCR to continue to do what I mentioned before, right? With regards to what we were doing, and I think the question is more like the legality part of it, where we
people saw influx of persons going into your office, and the assumption was that we
were not doing. It goes back to about 2010 when we signed a standard operating procedure, because there was no Department of Refugees. There was no entity in the government that was doing the documentation. At the time, the then government decided, Help for Progress is the partnering with UNHCR. We are an established NGOs. We have the work experience with refugees. So we signed a memorandum of understanding, or a standard operating procedure. And on the basis of that standard operating procedure for the reception of persons who were seeking asylum, we continued to do what we were doing, because our job entailed receiving the persons, doing a screening, and then assisting them with guiding them then with the process of the application and forwarding the document to my immigration. Our job was finished there. Immigration then decided if those persons would be given a status. Also, there was other steps that, for example, the national security would do a screening, send back the file to immigration. The step that was never completed was that after all these, the processes, the determination or the recognition of those persons, that was what was was not complete at the end. But
So you didn't, and I think that's what you're trying to explain, that you facilitated people through the application process, and then it went to the immigration department. Now, Kelleen, let's talk about the challenges of your organization and the challenges of working with the refugee populations across the world. I think many people ideally see this as should see this as a humanitarian effort, but with it comes the challenges on the countries themselves who choose to take in refugees, whether it's being able to face changing demographics, being able to face meeting the needs of these population. And across the world, we hear where countries are now starting to second guess whether or not they want to be able to assist those who are really in need of assistance. So let's talk about it from that standpoint.
Sure. Our global trends, World Refugee Day, as you said, was on June 20th. Which is a day to commemorate, refugees and also the communities that host them and welcome them, and really to talk about those issues. Shortly thereafter, I believe the next day or two, our global trends from 2016 came out, and there are more refugees and more displaced persons, forcibly displaced around the globe at any time since the records were being taken since the end of World War II. And so it is a big issue, and I think if I believe about 87% or something like that of the refugees in the world are actually in the developing world, in countries, neighboring countries, and it underscores the need to have countries working together and really thinking it's not an isolated issue. It's not this country, it's not that country. It's something that the international community and all of us have to think together about how to support those nations that that do host a lot of refugees, but may not have the ability to may not have the economic standards to do so. And I think that's something it's a little bit beyond our level here, but it's definitely what we're discussing in the international realm, and there are regional and international discussions. There will be in 2018 a global compact that will be discussed on refugee issues, and I think Belize is one part of this global thing. And I think you can't forget that countries, yes, some of them are struggling, and so that's why it's important to work together to figure out how to solve.
I'd imagine that the conversation has changed itself, because before, when you speak about people who are displaced, as I mentioned before, it was more of a humanitarian issue, but now there are other layers to add to this, as I pointed out, whether it's the changing demographics, which is one, but now we're looking at security issues, which is fundamental as well. And if you listen to some of the messages coming out of the United States, for example, people may be led to believe that it is safer to not take refugees. And I want you to respond to that, because when you hear these messages constantly, people will start to believe them.
Sure. I think one thing to remember is that the work that UNHCR and that the international community does to protect refugees is not in contradiction with security of states at all. They work together hand in hand. And so a strong, robust asylum system that people can access, so people who are fleeing are able to access and be more quickly adjudicated and have fair and efficient procedures, means you're going to more quickly know who's in your country. You're going to know who are the people who really need this assistance, and you're also able to find, not allow people who may be security threats to be part of that flow. And so that's part of why it's important. Obviously, every state wants to know who is in their borders, and that's part of, for us, it's the same thing. We want the same people who are fleeing these things to be able to come and, come out in the open. As I mentioned, really, these are people who are so grateful to be coming and really want to contribute, and so ensuring that they're able to come and be protected, it's really a benefit to the communities that are allowing them to come in. And can I just say one thing, because you had asked about the impact of refugees earlier, and I think just looking in Belize, just some of the people that we have, because as we mentioned, Belize in the 1990s, 80s and 90s had refugees coming in, and the people that we've talked to who are now, former refugees who are Belizeans include doctors and teachers and police officers and government officials and entrepreneurs and, people who had worked in agriculture. And and have assimilated to this culture. And I think, the hope is that part of the work that we do is to try to support the government and also other entities to be able to do something similar, so that people who are coming, who have no choice, who are fleeing, are able to learn English and able to contribute as quickly as possible. I mean, really, there's nothing more that these people want than that.
So
option.
when someone is granted refugee status, essentially what they're safe for is from the threat of being deported back to the country. What are there any other requirements that the country has to meet once someone is given refugee status?
Sure. Well, the safety from being returned, which is called refoulement in sort of international parlance, yes, that is fundamental. And that's basically from the moment. That means that people who are asylum seekers who haven't yet been adjudicated should be allowed access to the territory and not returned to the borders. And so that starts really from the moment the person enters the territory. We would have to go back and look again at the Belizean Refugees Act itself to see, because there definitely are other benefits. In most places, if you have someone recognized as a refugee, you're going to want to allow them to contribute. So, ability to work, work authorization, education, other opportunities, the ability really to participate and contribute in a way. And I think, it also, one other thing that I didn't mention on kind of related to this and the security is, you also, when people are able to be in the country and sort of stand out and are, have legal status, they're also more likely to come forward if they're victims or witnesses of crimes. Those are kinds of things too that I think are important to remember, that's a contribution to society as well.
Yeah. What do you find to be the greatest or the number one question that is asked about refugees in Belize? You can start with it. Yeah.
Yes. Again, the security issue,
so people are concerned about security.
That people have that, and to our surprise, in the communities that we move around, even the Central Americans, because they are in tune to what is happening in their country of origin, and they have this fear that culture of the crime will come to Belize. No?
Yeah.
They ask, for example, they have a lot of confidence in the security authorities. For example, constant checkpoints and things like that. What was not mentioned, that the security in terms of the even at the level of the eligibility committee, you have representation from in the eligibility committee, and they very much play a role in terms of their interest in ensuring that the people who are being recommended, are thoroughly screened and so forth. There is a process for that, I should say.
Yeah. I would say one question I think people also ask is sort of what does this population look like? And I think it's important also to remember, both in Belize and worldwide, about 50% of refugees worldwide are children, so under the age of 18. So we're talking very vulnerable people. So women, children, families, and that's what we see here as well. I mean, yes, young men, of course, if they're being forcibly recruited, you'll also see children, youth who may be fleeing for their lives, but definitely it's you or me, it's people, it's regular people who are in really extraordinary circumstances.
And the applications from what countries do they come from? The persons who are seeking refugee status.
Primarily, we are getting applications from countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
That raises certain concerns for. I look at this from the perspective of the Immigration Department, because I could recall a few weeks ago when the Minister of State was asked certain questions pertaining to the refugee situation. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the concerns that came up immediately in reference to these three Central American nations that you just mentioned is the fact that, for instance, in El Salvador, where there are certain stresses or certain social issues that one would be fleeing from, for instance, is the issue of the gang culture there. So it's almost as if though when you hear someone says, okay, I'm either an immigrant from El Salvador or I'm fleeing from El Salvador as a refugee, the first thought that comes to mind is, okay, there's the MS-13 and the Kaye Ultra or whatever, the 18th Street Gang. They immediately think, okay, there's this whole idea of the gang warfare that's taking place there. And in a sense, it kind of is a deterrent for anyone to want to accept someone from these countries because of fear that they may be bringing that mentality or what it is they're fleeing from to Belize. Would you be able to speak to that?
I mean, I think, kind of simply put, any refugees that you're talking about anywhere in the world are fleeing from something, are fleeing from someone who wants to hurt them or some kind of situation where there's violence going on. So whether it's gangs or other organizations or individuals who have, for some person who wants to hurt them for some reason. You're talking about people who are fleeing and who are the ones who are the victims of this kind of violence. So again, I think it has to go back to, recognizing that these aren't the perpetrators, that they're actually within the law. There are laws that say someone who has committed this kind of crime is not a refugee, right? So there's not the protection for those persons. That's, I think, the international community was very specific when setting up the international refugee regime and really wanted to protect the people who are fleeing from these kinds of things. And so,
those who just want to be safe.
Correct, exactly. And so that's, that's part of the whole international regime was built upon that, and Belize has followed upon that. And I think, the other thing that's important to remember is being a refugee is not a get out of jail free card. If someone is recognized as a refugee or as an asylum seeker and they break the law in the country where they're seeking asylum, they can be treated like any other person within the judicial system. So there's, that's not something that's a concern.
Now, it must be interesting, and I think a part of commemorating a day like this is looking at the stories of the people. And, that's kind of what I wanted to hear from you guys as well. We live in Belize and we have war issues with security. We know that, but it doesn't compare to persons who literally uproot their entire lives and family for fear of their own lives and just move, not many people in Belize have gotten to that point. We look at the crime and we think it's horrible, but I'm not saying today's the day I'm jumping on a plane, I'm getting away. So tell me about some of the stories that you hear from these people that make them choose to just leave everything behind and just seek somewhere that they feel that they could survive another day.
I mean, there are some, Rick may have some other examples, but I can think of some stories where, you'll hear from one person where another family member is at school or somewhere away and families get separated because a threat will come and say you need to leave immediately, and people have to leave. And these are people who have homes, who have jobs, who have family members, and I think that's the thing that really impacts you. It's just the normalcy of, people really working to just have a normal life, and then all of a sudden, because they live in the wrong area, they're the wrong age, they don't have the money to pay some kind of fee that they need to pay, they all of a sudden are forced to pick up and leave. And there are a lot of people who have left and come here, had quite a nice life in their home country and had their families, and unfortunately aren't able to take those things with them. So I think that's something else to remember is, people are coming here who have skills, have worked, really, have loved their families and maybe separated or maybe being reunited with their family members here. I'm not sure if you have other.
An example of the area of extortion, because we see a lot of cases of extortion in those countries. And the persons that are targeted are persons who are operating very small businesses. What happens is the organized criminals have people who would go to these business operators, the small business operators, and says, listen, my boss says that you are to pay so much. And you said, but that's too exorbitant. I can't afford that. He said, well, this is what he says. I'm just telling you. And sometimes they come with a phone and they speak directly. Pay up or face the whatever.
Or your family suffers.
And some people would pay the money, but then a month afterwards or so, they would come back and say, you know what, you are being asked to double the amount. And so they said, but how can I pay? And if you resist, then they tell you, well, pay this is fine, I'll pay this amount, or this could happen to you or your family. And that is what they're faced. And there are instances that they will tell that when they do not comply with the demands, families get murdered
Or go
That's it,
missing.
or go missing.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So we are talking about people who are suffering from that trauma, not only of losing their homes, but losing loved ones, and then needing to, flee to another country and start essentially their lives.
We have stories because sometimes you say, well, those stories could be made up, but when they come with statements from the authorities that saying that this happened,
Yeah.
we have to believe it because
Yeah.
it comes with the stamp and everything. Not all cases would be so evident, but we know.
Well, okay, so at this point, as you pointed out, and I think it is important for us to say that there are people in the country who have concerns about taking in refugees, and we know that this is a decision that is made by the government, and as you have clearly pointed out, it is ultimately up to the Eligibility Committee that is a government-run, that is a government committee with other members that makes a decision, and there is a very clear-cut criteria, right?
There is clear-cut criteria,
Yeah.
correct, yes. And the last thing I just wanted to say quickly is we understand some of the concerns, and part of the work that we're doing as well, not just supporting the government, is also supporting communities. So we're doing some projects in communities that are hosting refugees to try to help bring them together, but also create more security. We've built police stations, and a couple of communities have provided a motorcycle to police, and really trying to bring communities together, the Belizean communities that's hosting the refugees as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming in and being able to share this information for us. I think the more people understand and the more people they know, the more people know about refugees, then we'll be able to understand the situation even better. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We're going to go ahead and take a final break, and when we come back, we'll have our wrap-up.